Hello, I'm Dr. Scott Wadier.
And I'm Tommy Welling, and you're listening to the Fasting for Life podcast.
This podcast is about using fasting as a tool to regain your health, achieve ultimate wellness, and live the life you truly deserve.
Each episode is a short conversation on a single topic with immediate actionable steps. We cover everything from fat loss and health and wellness to the science of lifestyle design.
We started Fasting for Life because of how fasting has transformed our lives, and we hope to share the tools that we have learned along the way. Hey everyone, welcome to the Fasting for Life podcast. My name is Dr. Scott Wadier, and I'm here as always with my good friend and colleague, Tommy Welling. Good afternoon to you, sir.
Hey, Scott, how are you?
Fantastic, my friend. You got to show up if you want to get it done, and I am excited about today's conversation. I think it's going to be a good episode. First and foremost, I want to welcome all the listeners in. We are super appreciative as our reach continues to grow and the downloads continue to grow. All of you new folk that are joining us on the Fasting for Life journey and how to put fasting into your day-to-day life and turn it into a lifestyle. Get off the diet roller coaster and get the results and the long-term health benefits of fasting. We welcome you to it. If you want to hear more about Tommy and I, why we started the podcast, and kind of a little bit more about our journey in 20 or 30 minutes, you can head back to episode 0 and episode 1. Check those out. And for all the OG listeners, appreciate y'all tuning in. Continue to leave us positive reviews. That tells the podcast gods that we are doing something of value, and we're not just speaking, to ourselves across Zoom. So we're going to talk about how to engage with us and to keep the lifestyle conversation going and to keep it conversational. If you want to head to the show notes, you can join our Facebook community. It's a free community where every single week, we have a pinned topic and conversation around that fasting lifestyle. And today, Tommy, we're going to talk about a couple of interesting articles, but we're really not going to go into the science of the article too much. One was a randomized controlled trial on a small change approach to prevent long-term weight gain. And then the other was, what happens after a weight loss intervention? When time-restricted eating, so aka fasting, was used. And we could talk about the actual studies, but the outcomes, or I should say the nuance in between the outcomes, was more applicable to what we always typically say on the podcast and in our challenges and in our groups is we want to begin with the end in mind, which is not becoming part of the 95% that can lose weight, but then at 2-year mark, you end up being not able to maintain it, right? Yeah. So we want to be the 5% that can get to a healthy weight, that can get to a level of health and quality of life that we deserve, and then obviously maintain that and massage that as we go through the later decades of life. So we're going to zoom in and out a couple times today, and I think it's going to be impactful. So let's dive into the SCA or a small change approach to prevent long-term weight gain in adults with overweight and obesity, which was a big randomized controlled trial.
Yeah, and just that title, I mean, that sounds really good, right? A small change approach to prevent long-term weight gain. So, what I heard there is, hey, if we don't have to do too many different things, if I don't have to control for too many different moving parts or variables, maybe I can still prevent long-term weight gain. And that sounds really good, especially if I'm already battling with being overweight and or obese, because I don't just have a need to lose the weight. I also need to prevent long-term weight gain because that's what I've already been doing over time. And that's kind of like where the inertia, where the momentum is. It's easy to continue to gain that weight. So I have to stop that process. And then maybe I can consider trying to, get the weight off. So if I can do that with just a small change versus like a major lifestyle overhaul, that sounds pretty appealing right there. So I was very interested just coming into this article like that.
Yeah. And this was, they did the study in the population, and it says, 63% of adults in Canada currently live with overweight or obesity, right? And we know that in adults and overweight with obesity has negative associations with adverse outcomes such as cancer, all-cause and cardiovascular disease-related death, poor quality of life, diabetes, metabolic syndrome, et cetera. we know in the States, depending on where the stats you look at, upwards of 70 to 74% of the population and 30 to 40% of the population is obese, but either obese and overweight brings that number all the way up to almost a 75% mark, or the three-fourths of the country, right? So our neighbors to the north are not doing much better than we are here in the States. And when we're looking at how to tackle this problem, of how to stop the weight gain, right? Which is typically what we see here like you mentioned, in the States as we go through the later decades. It personally happened to me, was happening to you, right? 20s, it was like, okay, yeah, a little big. 30s, okay. The energy's kind of not doing great. More brain fog, more achy. But like I work in a health profession. I do health talks and I work out and I eat right and all this stuff and
tracking all the calories,
right? It wasn't working. So it's like, okay, what can I do? All right, well, started digging. So you can get really complex with this process, and we have an information overload now more than ever. And it's like, okay, well, the standard eat less and move more approach can be overwhelming, and also can carry a lot of shame and guilt from the failures if you've done it a bunch of times. So that's why when I saw the small change approach, I was like, ooh, okay, let's see if this is sustainable. Because when we look at the diabetes studies that are out there that look at, like, let's say making a big lifestyle change. You've eaten all of these yummy, satiating foods that are chemically
engineered.
What's the word I want to use? Engineered
to
have a mouthfeel and to hit the centers of the brain that are telling you, wow, I really like this. The craveability of food, all that stuff, right?
Yeah.
The hedonic food scale, the want versus the need of it, right? And it's like, okay, well, when you look at the diabetes studies at the 2-year mark, going low carb, making a big change like that after all these years of eating it and consuming it and having those deep rooted habits in it, now you're like, okay, well, no kidding. After doing it for long enough, your willpower kind of fades. You get bored with it. And then you go back to the stuff that gets you kind of like paint yourself in a corner, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Do you think that might be because you've made too many changes, like all at once?
Yeah.
And because like maybe you start to see diminishing returns on like what those changes are, or you kind of get used to the fact that, okay, well, this kind of feels easy. The results are here, and then you just kind of slip with the discipline, or maybe you were using willpower that whole time, and then you kind of just start to backslide into some of those old habits, and then the calories creep in, the insulin resistance comes back because you're spiking the insulin, little insulin overload, and it's easy for us to kind of get back on the regain train, if you will.
Well, but that's where fasting comes into play, right? Because even if you are going low carb, or in this small change approach study, where it was, an energy decrease of 100 calories a day or 2,000 steps, right? Combining those two is about, 200 total calorie deficit, which is a very small deficit. Most calorie deficits to lose weight, it's going to be based on 0.4 to 0.8% of your total body weight with a maximum of 1% per week. We're talking industry standards here, right? With fasting, you can accelerate that process without long-term negative effects. We did a whole episode on, losing weight too fast and the pro versus cons of keeping the weight on or never even getting it off because you get stuck in the muck trying to get there, right?
Yeah.
So when we're looking at this small change, that's where fasting and the insulin resistance or the carb insulin model of obesity comes into play, because you can be doing low carb, but eating 3 to 4 to 5 plus snacks times a day, and you're constantly stimulating insulin. So with this small change approach, it was like, okay, yeah, great. Same thing with the other study we're going to talk about, with the TRE study. They had a 10-hour window. Well, you could graze the entire time and keep a low level of insulin up, which isn't going to allow you to actually get into a fat burning mode. Your cravings are going to be crazy.
Habits are terrible.
Habits are terrible. And then again, you've painted yourself into a corner. So the small change approach, I'm not shocked when we looked at the results.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Because, when we look at it and they go, okay, well, those changes were good and they were beneficial at the 3-month mark and the 6 and 12 and even up to the 15-month mark. They had a significant albeit a relatively small but statistically significant difference from just the monitored group, where they weren't making those small changes. So they were effective in having a beneficial effect for up to that 15-month mark. But by the time they looked at it at the 24-month mark the next time and the 36-month mark, there was no statistical significance. So those small benefits from those small changes had eroded over time. And by the time we hit that 2-year mark, you're back to that whole 95% and 5%, differentiation there, where most folks in those groups had no difference, whether they were making the small change or they weren't making the small change. So it's kind of like, well, like, what was the point at the end of it? And I would love to see if there was some subjective data in here, but there wasn't, as far as why. Like, why did those habits and the discipline points and the actual things, those small changes, like, why did they erode over time? Did I stop walking at all? Did I dose an extra tablespoon of olive oil here and there? Right? Like 100 calorie difference. What happened to kind of erode those by the 24-month mark?
And that was the conclusion. It was like, okay, well, our principal finding does not support earlier evidence showing the promise of small change approach as a pragmatic and more effective strategy for the prevention of weight gain. So again, we're talking about one portion of the process.
Yeah.
So like, we got to stop the gaining and the habits that cause the gaining before we even talk about the losing and then the sustainability of the losing.
Yeah. Right.
Which is why the other article with the one that was out of the Journal of Appetite in 2022, so it just came out this last July, was what happens after a weight loss intervention. So we just had a weight gain intervention, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or a maintenance intervention.
Yeah.
And it was a qualitative study of drivers and challenges. And this is where we really like the conversation. A qualitative study of drivers and challenges of maintaining time-restricted eating among people with overweight at high risk of type 2 diabetes. So similar groups here being looked at, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they were using a 10-hour daily window.
Eating window. Yeah, after a 14-hour
eating window,
fast,
right? So time-restricted eating, 10-14, right? So that's not even at the level of what a basic intermittent fasting beginner window would be, which would be 16-8,
mm-hmm.
right? 16 hours of fasting, 8 hours of a nutrition or eating window, right?
Yeah, right.
So to the point of your habits, it was interesting when we started looking through this, there was a couple of things that really stood out, Tommy, that kind of were like, okay, well, after a weight loss intervention, why can't we maintain it? If we've been able to slow down the gaining and then actually get some loss, now we've got the complication of, well, how are we going to maintain it?
Yeah. And it's a long-term question, and I thought it was interesting. They're showing what happened within this study, and already even just that 10-hour window, which most folks, if you've done intermittent fasting, it doesn't take all that much mental energy to complete a 14-hour fast and then eat within a 10-hour window, right? Just skipping breakfast is basically almost going to get you there.
Right.
So 15% within the study quit, over time anyway. So 15% dropped off, and then only about 35% maintained strict compliance, within the given windows, and about half of the participants engaged with days off. So they were kind of hit and miss. Maybe they were somewhere in the 40 to 60% kind of compliance range. So I thought just understanding the fact that there's drop off even when you know what to do and it's not all that difficult to do means like you already have a potential hurdle in the way of maintaining those results that you got over time.
Yeah, and when you started looking at some of the examples of what people were saying, right? So when we didn't have a lot of subjective data in the last one, there's a ton of subjective data in this one, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you've ever attempted to lose weight and it's gone miserably, you know what I'm talking about. You get up all in your feels, right? It's like, oh man, like mental gymnastics start happening, right? And you're like, the crushing weight of, all right, well, here we go. I got to get my blood work again. And I know my doc's going to tell me to lose weight. Awesome.
Yep.
My wife's nagging me to do this, or my husband's telling me I need to do that. Or my mom called me and said, hey, you look a little thick there, son. What's going on?
Yeah.
You're like, okay, it's the camera angle on the phone, Ma.
Yeah.
Cool.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. All of those things that we take with us, right? So
Yeah.
some of the stuff here, and I know you kind of summarize it into like two main categories, Tommy, but the cool things were like the drivers for maintenance, the patterns for maintenance, the challenges for maintenance, and really the idea was to be able to keep a time restricted window, right? So
Mhm.
the drivers were, during the study where you felt more energized. What we like to call the marriage merge. The spouse was moving the dinner time, or even the spouse was contributing to the dinner process, right?
Mhm.
Or the husband or wife would move the time earlier or later so then they could match up with the family, or putting structure into your day-to-day life to be able to, make that time restricted window match. And that really highlights probably the most difficult thing for anyone making any lifestyle change,
Mhm.
right? Is one of the two main categories, which is that support piece.
Yeah, and what do you think about just the predictability of it? Like the meal pattern predictability, that was a huge outcome, predictor for this, was just being able to know what are my meal patterns. So just introducing a little bit of kind of like normalcy or predictability. Like a lot of folks used to have a more predictable, let's say like a dinner schedule. Like my parents or my grandparents will oftentimes talk about, oh yeah, it was always dinner on the table 5 o'clock, or dinner at 6 o'clock every single night, and everybody was around the dinner table 6 o'clock. But now it feels like it's so much more unpredictable, variable everywhere. Everyone's in different places. Dinner's on at the same time every night. Is that necessarily bad? No, but the predictability or lack thereof was a huge outcome predictor in how easy was it to maintain compliance with something as quote unquote simple as like a 14-hour fast and a 10-hour eating window. Like your compliance mattered with that predictability.
Yeah, 100%. And it was interesting to see kind of some of the other studies that they reference here when they talk about TRE, right? So it's like TRE encourages individual preferences while eliminating common challenges of dietary recommendations, right? Such as careful attention to calorie intake, hence the small changes in the small change approach, right? That we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
Portion sizes, proportions. Oh, whoops, my hand slipped, extra little oil, right? Okay, well, do that every day over the course of a year, it adds up an extra tablespoon, right?
Yep.
So that to me sounds like death by 1,000 paper cuts.
Yeah.
Some of the other interesting ones were like, TRE shows promising effects on weight loss, glucose metabolism, cardiometabolic health, associated with decreased feelings of hunger and late night evening food intake, and lower consumption of energy dense, calorie dense, high calorie, low satiating foods. But only a few studies have ever examined people's experiences with performing the actual restriction. And it's been mostly survey items. And then there were no studies looking at the actual maintenance, including the drivers and challenges. So it was cool to see where they were coming from and that support piece, right? And that's why we have the Fasting for Life community. That's why we do the challenges 8 times a year. That's why we come every single week with a podcast conversation, because you might be living in an external world that people don't understand why you're doing it. And they're going to, not to condone you or to shame you, but it's like they just don't understand what your motivating factors are. Why the heck would you skip a meal, right? So you're a salmon swimming upstream and you don't have the support. And that's why we have the community group, where it's like-minded people that listen to the podcast, that know you and I, that can go in and you can talk about fasting and actually get answers to the questions that are individualized to you, which is everything the word jargon I just said, all of those different highlights of the different studies, right? Well, what's missing is that ability to have that conversation and get that support, right? And then the second one was something we talk a lot about, which was like, put some dang structure or a plan in, and don't think you can wing it and make a last minute decision.
No, and you better be prepared for some of those things, those non-negotiables to pop up, or some of the random invitations to come up. But because you can't just put off like enjoyable experiences or what you consider important parts of life. Like you could put aside a few of those, right? Like if you're on a strict diet, or you're really looking for this particular goal, but we need to understand how to pivot. And that's why we talk a lot about pivots in the podcast and during the challenges, and just pretty much anytime we're talking about fasting, we're talking about pivots, how to know what my plan is, but also what will I do if I get a really like not tempting, but like a really important invitation, or something is on my schedule. How do I reconcile like an important lunch or dinner with what my fasting plan was? I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I don't want to completely derail myself, and I want to feel like this is sustainable long term. So this was actually an important predictor in the compliance results in this study as well, was understanding how to pivot, getting those kind of opportunities coming up, but then being able to feel like I'm still on track, I'm still doing the right thing and making the right decision without that blame and shame and guilt coming into the equation and derailing me.
Yeah, and it's interesting because one of the things they said, to come off of that was like they actually argued that people with less consistency in the daily rhythms and eating patterns should not be introduced to TRE. And I'm going, no, virtual medium. I just raised my hand. Yeah, so that did nothing for the listener. So I literally raised my hand and Tommy laughed at me because I do this all the time because I forget. Nobody can see us. But my thing is like, well, no, like this is probably why when you start intermittent fasting, you can't get it to stick. This is why we have the fast start guide. It's like how to put 1 meal a day fasting into your life. Like let's simplify it's 6 steps. Simplification. Yeah. So like they're saying, well, yeah, if people have less consistency in daily, I have 3 kids under 5, right? A wife that has a business, 2 businesses. I travel like a horse, 3 dogs. It's like, that is the definition of lack of consistency, right?
Right.
But it's successful because it simplifies the patterns, right? So they're saying, well, maybe those people shouldn't be introduced. And I'm saying, no, those are the people, we're saying that those are the people that need it. What?
The most.
More, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, so it's interesting because the regimens, to become more successful, new habits need to be formed, right? In that habitual behavior. And the participants that were struggling to maintain the TRE have not received what they said was the enough guidance and support related to forming a new habit or a new TRE behavior.
Yeah.
And then you add in like the lack of support and guidance in the personal or social constructs. Mm-hmm. And it's like, okay, well, you need that personalized guidance. And that's why we want you guys to come and join the community group and continue the conversation. We're in there, we're commenting, and everybody in this group has a similar goal, right? And an understanding that fasting is going to be part of the long-term solution.
Yeah, and that's a crazy thing because when we're comparing these 2 articles, like at first glance, that small change approach sounds really tempting. It sounds easy. It sounds easier, versus fasting, quote unquote. And that feels like, oh my gosh, like, I don't even know what that means. Do I have to change everything? Sounds like a lifestyle overhaul versus maybe just a small tweak.
15 minutes of walking and no creamer in my coffee. Okay, got it.
Easy, right? But then it's not moving the needle. And over time, it just kind of erodes and it doesn't do anything anyway. And on the flip side of fasting, we don't have to see it as a lifestyle overhaul. There's a few things that if we understand, okay, where do I prioritize? What are my important pivots? How do I do that? And then how do I keep myself from being preoccupied with thinking this weight should just magically be flying off and the scale should just be consistently just dropping just pound after pound after pound. If I can like insulate myself from a couple of those things and go in with some tools in my tool belt, or continue to level those up as I try new things with my fasting lifestyle, it becomes easier with reps. It becomes easier and easier over time. And the needle does continue to move versus what sounded like the easy way to do it, which was the small change approach that ends up not doing anything over long term.
Right. But sounds so much easier and so much better. Does. Right. Yeah. So it's interesting because one of the insulation pieces too is like, all right, if you fail to plan, then you plan to fail. So I want to encourage y'all, for the listeners today as we wrap up, is make sure, if you've been intermittent fasting and the consistency has been lacking, doing a 50% of a perfect plan 100% of the time is better than doing 100% perfect plan 50% of the time.
Yeah.
So what you need to do is just show up consistently. And Tommy's laughing because I say that backwards, like 100% of the time. So let me say some more numbers so I can get myself up in the air and completely confuse everybody.
Great.
The point is so if you're struggling with it and you're like, well, it's not consistent. Okay, then just pick one thing. Take the simplicity of the small change approach and apply it to fasting, not the model that got you here in the first place, right? So, all right, pick a timer, plan your week out. Say, you know that the office orders lunch on Thursdays. Make that one of your meals and make one better decision for that meal. So instead of getting Whataburger, go to Chipotle and get a burrito bowl, right? Like make one small change and consistently try to do that with your TRE every single day, and you're going to start seeing some traction, right?
Yeah,
so
there you go.
I want to encourage everyone to continue the conversation. Come to the community group. It's free. Sign up. It's an awesome environment. Ton of great people in there. We're in there commenting, encouraging Tommy. So great conversation today, sir. I did not know that we were going to end up at this endpoint after we started looking at these articles and be like, oh, what can we get out of here that would be really cool? Well, back to the basics, right? You need support. You need the right support. You need to be personalized and timely. And you need to learn how to take life on when it throws itself at you, that you have a plan in place to allow you to succeed. So
absolutely.
As always, sir, appreciate the conversation. We'll see you guys inside of the community group. Head to the show notes and we'll talk soon, Tommy. Thank you, sir.
Perfect. Thank you. Bye.
So, you've heard today's episode and you may be wondering, where do I start? Head on over to thefastingforlife.com and sign up for our newsletter, where you'll receive fasting tips and strategies to maximize results and fit fasting into your day-to-day life.
While you're there, download your free Fast Start guide to get started today. Don't forget to subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Make sure to leave us a 5-star review, and we'll be back next week with another episode of Fasting for Life.